check presenter lay on the table like a closed casket. Clara felt a familiar dread coil in her stomach, the kind that always preceded the final tally of a long, grueling shift. The man in the corner booth, the one with eyes the color of a winter sky and a suit that cost more than her car, had been her sole focus for the last 2 hours. He hadn't just been a customer. He'd been an ordeal. She picked up the leather folder, her fingers tracing the embossed logo of Aria, one of Chicago's most ostentatiously expensive restaurants. The place was a cathedral of fine dining, and she was just a lowly acolyte, perpetually praying for the generosity of its wealthy parishioners. She opened it. The bill was for $387.50. Her eyes darted to the receipt he had signed. Subtotal, $387.50. Tip, a thick, deliberate line drawn through the space, followed by a stark, unapologetic $0. Total, $387.50. Zero. Not a token dollar, not a curt 10%. A void. An insult carved in black ink. From across the room, Tiffany, another waitress who survived on a diet of nicotine and schadenfreude, shot her a smirk. "Tough break, sweetie," she mouthed, before turning to laugh with the bartender. The heat of humiliation crept up Clara's neck. That tip, a standard 20%, would have been nearly $80. $80 was the specialized brace her son, Danny, needed for his physical therapy. It was a week of groceries. It was a shield against the crushing weight of being a single mother in a city that had no mercy for the financially fragile. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and useless. She fought them back. Crying wouldn't pay the rent. With a surge of angry energy, she began clearing the table, stacking the heavy porcelain plates with more force than necessary. As she snatched up the large, decorative charger plate, something caught her eye. It wasn't a stray crumb or a forgotten cufflink. It was a small, folded piece of heavy cream-colored cardstock, tucked neatly beneath where his dinner plate had rested. Her heart gave a strange, hopeful leap. Maybe he left cash. But as she unfolded it, she saw it wasn't money. It was a note written in a precise, architectural script. It contained just 7 words, a sentence that felt less like a message and more like a summons. And the man who wrote it, she would soon learn, wasn't just a difficult customer. He was a crucible, and everyone he met was being tested for its fire. The dinner service at Aria was a tightly choreographed ballet of controlled chaos. Clara wiped a bead of sweat from her temple, her movements economical, honed by years of practice. Her feet, encased in the restaurant-mandated orthopedic, yet somehow still painful black shoes, sent dull, throbbing signals up her legs. She'd been on them for 10 hours, a double shift she'd picked up when another waitress called in sick. She never said no to a double. "Miller, table 4 needs their check, and the party in the vineyard room is asking for you," barked Mr. Dubois, the manager. He was a man who wielded his minor authority like a weapon, his French accent thickening whenever he was displeased, which was often. He disliked Clara for her quiet efficiency, which he mistook for a lack of ambition, and for the fact that she never stayed for after-work drinks. She couldn't. The last bus to her side of town left at 11:45 p.m., and Danny's babysitter, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, couldn't stay past midnight. "On it, Mr. Dubois," Clara said, her voice a placid mask over her exhaustion. As she ran a credit card for a table of tourists who were arguing about the exchange rate, her mind drifted to the small, cluttered desk in her apartment. Pinned to the corkboard was a quote from a specialist at the children's hospital. Danny, her bright, resilient 7-year-old, had been born with a rare form of muscular dystrophy. He wasn't dying, the doctors assured her, but his life would be a series of challenges. The newest challenge was a custom-fitted dynamic orthosis brace that would help support his spine and allow him more mobility. Her insurance, A flimsy plan with a deductible the size of a mountain covered only a fraction of the cost. She was $800 short. Today was Tuesday. The fitting was next Monday. Her focus snapped back to the present. Tiffany sashayed over, flipping her blonde ponytail. "Guess who just got sat in the corner booth?" she said, a malicious glee in her eyes. "Julian Croft." Clara's blood ran cold. Julian Croft wasn't just a regular billionaire. He was a Chicago institution, the scion of an old money empire who had taken his father's sprawling, chaotic conglomerate and reshaped it into a streamlined, formidable titan of industry. The papers called him the architect for his methodical, unemotional approach to business. They also said he was notoriously difficult, a perfectionist who could spot a flaw from a mile away and took a grim pleasure in pointing it out. "Why aren't you taking him?" Clara asked. Tiffany was a shark who smelled money in the water. She always fought for the big tables. Tiffany laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound. "Are you kidding? I had him last month. He sent back a bottle of wine, a $900 bottle, because he claimed the vintage was psychologically disappointing." "He doesn't tip, Clara. He dissects. He audits your soul and then leaves you nothing for the trouble. I've got that table of loudmouth real estate developers. They're morons, but they're generous morons. The architect is all yours." She slapped a heavy, leather-bound menu into Clara's hands and walked away, her hips swaying in victory. Clara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. Refusing a table was grounds for immediate dismissal. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with Danny's brace hanging in the balance. She took a slow, deep breath, straightened the lapels of her uniform vest, and walked toward the secluded booth. Julian Croft wasn't looking at his phone like most lone diners. He was studying the architecture of the room, his gaze sweeping over the vaulted ceilings and the intricate woodwork. He was younger than she expected, perhaps late 30s, with a severe handsomeness that was more intimidating than attractive. He wore a dark grey suit with a subtle pinstripe, tailored so perfectly it seemed fused to his frame. When his eyes finally met hers, they were a startlingly clear, analytical grey. They weren't cruel, but they were utterly devoid of warmth. "Good evening, sir," Clara began, summoning her most professional smile. "Welcome to Aria. My name is Clara, and I'll be your server this evening." He cut her off, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "The wine list." It wasn't a request. "Of course, sir." When she returned with the tome-like list, he didn't even glance at it. "You have the 1982 Chateau Margaux," he stated. "We do, sir." "An excellent choice. Is it from the original cellar acquisition of 1995, or is it part of the secondary consignment purchased at auction in 2011? Clara blinked. No one had ever asked that. Most servers would have to run to the sommelier, looking flustered. But Clara was different. Before her life took a turn that led her to waitressing, she had spent 2 years as an assistant to a rare book and document appraiser. Her real passion, the one she pursued late at night when Danny was asleep, was the meticulous restoration of old photographs. She had a mind wired for provenance, for history, for the tiny details that told the real story. She had read Aria's entire cellar history on a slow afternoon, fascinated by it. "It's from the 95 acquisition, sir," she said, her voice steady. "The bottles from the 2011 auction are stored at a different temperature to account for their travel history. Mr. Dubois believes it preserves the integrity of the original stock." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through Julian Croft's eyes before being extinguished. "I see. I'll have a glass." "A single glass of the 82 Margaux, sir?" A glass alone was over $400. "Is there an echo in here, Clara?" he asked, his voice flat. "No, sir. Right away." The entire evening followed the same pattern. He ordered the duck confit, but quizzed her on the specific variety of cherry used in the gastric. He asked about the artist who painted the landscape hanging opposite their booth. With each question, Clara drew upon the reservoir of seemingly useless information she had accumulated over the years. She knew the artist was a local painter from the 1920s. She knew the cherries were Amarelle, sourced from a specific orchard in Michigan. She answered each query calmly and precisely. He never said thank you. He never smiled. He just absorbed her answers with a quiet, unnerving intensity. Finally, he pushed his plate away, a few bites remaining. "Is there anything else, Mr. Croft?" He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time all night. "You're overqualified for this job," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation. "I do my best, sir." "That's not what I said. I've observed you for 2 hours. Your movements are efficient to the second. You anticipate nudes before they arise. You retain information that 99% of the population would deem trivial. Yet you work in a profession that relies on feigned subservience and the whims of strangers. It's an illogical waste of talent. Why? It was a trap. A personal question from a customer was always a trap. But his directness disarmed her. The truth tumbled out, a quiet, weary confession. "I have a son. He has medical needs that require a flexible schedule and immediate cash flow. This job, for all its faults, provides that. Or it's supposed to." She regretted the words instantly. She had sounded like she was asking for pity. His expression hardened. "So you're gambling," he said coldly. "You're betting that the compassion of people who barely see you as human will be enough to secure your son's future. A foolish bet. Hope is not a strategy." The cruelty of it was a physical blow. She felt the anger rise, hot and sharp, eclipsing her exhaustion. "I am not gambling, sir," she said, her voice low and trembling with a rage she hadn't felt in years. "I am surviving. I work 60 hours a week. I haven't had a day off in 3 months. I do what is necessary. It is the only strategy I have." She turned on her heel before he could reply, her composure shattering. She fled to the small alcove by the kitchen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Don't let him see you cry. Just get the check. Pray he wasn't as cruel with his wallet as he was with his words, and go home to Danny." When she returned 10 minutes later, he was gone. The table was empty, except for the black leather bill folder. And inside, the insulting, dismissive, soul-crushing 0. As she stood there, reeling from the final blow, she saw the note, tucked under the charger plate. She picked it up, her hands shaking, and unfolded it. It read, "Your memory is an asset. My office. 9 a.m. Discretion is paramount." Below the words was an address on Wacker Drive, in one of the most prestigious office towers in the city. There was no signature, but none was needed. "What's that?" Tiffany's voice sliced through her thoughts. Clara crumpled the note in her fist, shoving it deep into her apron pocket. "Nothing," she said, her voice hoarse. "He left a complaint." "Figures," Tiffany sneered, turning away. Clara finished clearing the table on autopilot, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. It was a test. The whole evening had been an elaborate, cruel test. But for what? A job? A joke? And what did he mean? Discretion is paramount? Was this some rich man's bizarre game? She looked at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. She had a choice. She could go home, defeated, and try to scrape together the money for Danny's brace some other way. Or she could walk into the lion's den at 9 a.m. and find out what the architect was building. She touched the crumpled note in her pocket. "Hope is not a strategy," he had said. Maybe he was right. Maybe this note wasn't hope. Maybe it was a blueprint. The next morning, Clara stood before the Croft Enterprises building, a sleek, imposing tower of black glass and steel that seemed to pierce the clouds. She wore her only interview outfit, a simple black dress, a grey blazer she'd bought at a consignment shop, and low heels. She felt like a sparrow trying to blend in with a flock of eagles. The lobby was a cavern of marble and hushed importance. At the front desk, a receptionist with a headset and an air of bored superiority eyed her disapprovingly. "Can I help you?" "I have a 9 o'clock appointment with Mr. Croft," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. The receptionist's perfectly sculpted eyebrow rose. "Mr. Croft doesn't take unscheduled appointments. Your name?" "Clara Miller." The woman typed, her long nails clicking on the keyboard. Her expression shifted from disdain to confusion. "It says here, Priority Alpha. Go on up, 85th floor." The elevator ride was a silent, stomach-lurching ascent. The 85th floor was the opposite of the bustling lobby. It was serene and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a godlike view of Chicago. A severe-looking woman in her 50s, who introduced herself as Julian's executive assistant, Eleanor, led her into his office. The office was vast, but sparsely furnished. A massive mahogany desk, 2 leather chairs, and an entire wall of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Julian Croft was not at his desk. He was standing in front of a large, framed photograph that hung on the wall. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and dark trousers. He looked less like a CEO and more like a scholar. "You're punctual," he said, without turning around. "Punctuality is the foundation of respect." "My father used to say it's the one currency the poor can afford to spend lavishly," Clara replied. He turned then, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. A wise man. "Come here." She walked toward him, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. The photograph he was studying was old, sepia-toned, and clearly damaged. It depicted a group of men in turn-of-the-century work clothes, standing in front of a half-finished building. A large water stain obscured the lower right corner, and a chemical fade had bleached out several faces. "This is the first building my great-grandfather ever constructed," Julian said, his voice softer than it had been in the restaurant. "The cornerstone of our family's legacy. This photograph is the only known record of the original partners. For decades, we've only been able to identify 3 of them. The 4th man, the one standing on the far right, has remained a mystery." He gestured to the faded figure. "My company is currently facing a hostile takeover attempt from a rival firm, Reed Global. They are led by a woman named Evelyn Reed. Her claim is that her great-grandfather was the 4th partner and was cheated out of his shares by mine. Her proof is a handwritten ledger from that era. Our problem is that the original partnership agreement, which would disprove her claim, was lost in the Great Chicago Fire. All we have is this." He tapped the glass of the photo. "My team of analysts, historians, and forensic experts have all said the same thing. The damage is too extensive. The man's face, the name on his overalls, any identifying marks are gone forever." He finally looked at her, his grey eyes intense. "At the restaurant you remembered the provenance of a wine bottle and the history of a painting. You see details. So, see this. Tell me what they've all missed." Clara's heart pounded. This was the real test. It wasn't about duck confit or vintage wine. It was about this. She stepped closer to the photograph, her waitress persona falling away, replaced by the meticulous focus of the restorer. She wasn't looking at the people anymore. She was looking at the medium itself. The paper, the chemicals, the damage. "It's a silver gelatin print," she murmured, thinking aloud. "The fading is consistent with prolonged exposure to sunlight. The water damage? It's interesting. The way the emulsion has lifted at the edges suggests it was submerged, then dried too quickly, probably with heat. She leaned in, her nose almost touching the glass. The man. His face is gone. But look at his hands. She pointed to the man's left hand, which rested on a wooden crate. He's wearing a ring, a signet ring. It's faint, but you can see the light catching the edge of it. Julian was silent, watching her. But that's not it, she continued, her excitement growing. The ledger Evelyn Reed is using as proof. What kind of paper is it? Standard linen bond, why? And the ink? Iron gall ink, common for the period. Clara looked back at the photograph, at the crate the mystery man was touching. The water stain had bled the ink of the crate's shipping label, but one word was partially visible. Kego Paper Co. She squinted. Underneath the big letters there's a slogan, faded, almost invisible. Her mind, so adept at deciphering faded text in old documents, went to work. Our quality is the cornerstone of your business. She stepped back from the photo. The Chicago Paper Company didn't adopt that slogan until 1912. The building in this photograph was completed in 1908. The ledger Ms. Reed is presenting as period authentic is written on paper that wasn't manufactured until at least 4 years later. The ledger is a forgery. The silence in the room was absolute. Julian stared at the photograph, then back at Clara, his face a mask of astonishment. He walked to his desk, picked up a phone, and pressed a button. Eleanor, get legal on the line. I want a full forensic analysis of the Reed ledger, specifically the paper's watermark and chemical composition. Tell them to look for a slogan from the Chicago Paper Company, post-1912. He hung up the phone and looked at Clara, his expression unreadable. I have a team of 50 lawyers, a dozen PIs, and a budget that could fund a small country. None of them saw that. They were looking at the man, Clara said simply, not at the world around him. I left you a $0 tip last night, he said, his voice flat. I'm aware. It was a calculated insult. I wanted to see if you would break, if you would become emotional, unprofessional. You became angry, but you maintained your composure. That combined with this, he gestured to the photograph, is a rare combination of skills. He walked to the window, looking out over the city. I am surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. They are sycophants, liars, or ambitious sharks waiting for the scent of blood in the water. I need someone who sees the truth, even if it's faded and in the margins. Someone who isn't afraid to state it. He turned back to her. I'm creating a new position, head of the Department of Archival Research and Strategic Analysis. It's your job to be the company's memory. You'll analyze old contracts, vet new partnerships, examine every detail we've overlooked. You will report directly, and only to me. The salary is $250,000 a year, full benefits, and a corporate apartment downtown. You start immediately. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It was an impossible, life-altering offer, born from the most humiliating night of her life. Mr. Croft, I don't have a college degree. I'm a waitress. I'm not hiring a degree, he said, his voice sharp. I'm hiring a mind. I can teach you the business. I cannot teach you how to see. Do you accept? She thought of Danny. She thought of the brace, the therapies, the future she could give him. She thought of the condescending smirks of Tiffany and the petty tyranny of Mr. Dubois. Yes, she whispered. I accept. Good, he said, a hint of warmth finally entering his voice. Welcome to Croft Enterprises, Miss Miller. Your first task is to go home, pack your things and never set foot in that restaurant again. Oh, and send me the bill for your son's medical device. All of it." He then did something that surprised her more than anything else. He reached into his wallet, pulled out $80 in cash, and held it out to her. "My apologies," Julian Croft said, "for the tip." The transition from a cramped, walk-up apartment that smelled of old plumbing to a sleek, modern apartment on the 50th floor of a downtown high-rise was dizzying. For the first week, Clara felt like she was playing a role in someone else's life. Movers packed her few belongings with reverent care. A car service was at her disposal. Danny was evaluated by the top pediatric specialist in the Midwest, his new brace and a comprehensive therapy plan covered entirely by the company's premier health insurance. Her work was demanding, but exhilarating. She spent her days in a quiet, sunlit office adjacent to Julian's, sifting through a century of corporate history. She was a detective, and the clues were hidden in dusty ledgers, forgotten blueprints, and microfilmed correspondence. She discovered that a small parcel of land the company owned, long considered worthless, sat atop a massive lithium deposit. She found a clause in a 50-year-old contract that gave them leverage over a key supplier. She was good at it. For the first time in a long time, she felt like herself. Her relationship with Julian was strictly professional, yet an undercurrent of something more was developing. It was in the way he would bring her a coffee in the morning, remembering she liked a hint of cinnamon in it. It was in the long evenings they spent working side by side, debating a legal point or puzzling over an old map, the city lights twinkling below them like a fallen constellation. She saw the man behind the fearsome reputation. Brilliant, yes, but also isolated by his wealth and position, haunted by the legacy of a father he both admired and resented. But a new player had entered the game. With the Reed global takeover thwarted by Clara's discovery, Evelyn Reed had not disappeared. Instead, in a move of audacious corporate maneuvering, she had leveraged a block of shares her family secretly held to force her way onto the Croft Enterprises board of directors. Clara's first meeting with Evelyn was in the executive boardroom. Evelyn was a woman who seemed forged from ice and ambition. Tall, elegant, with sharp blue eyes, and a smile that never reached them, she radiated a chilling competence. "So you're the company's new oracle," Evelyn said, her voice smooth as silk but laced with venom. She looked Clara up and down, her gaze lingering on Clara's simple, professional dress. "The waitress who can read tea leaves in old photographs. A charming story. I'm sure the press will love it." "I just look for the facts, Miss Reed," Clara replied calmly. "Facts can be malleable," Evelyn said, turning her attention to Julian, who stood at the head of the table. "Julian, darling, while I admire your penchant for finding diamonds in the rough, this is a multi-billion-dollar corporation, not a fairy tale. We need proven executives, not pet projects. Clara's work has already saved this company over $1 billion, Julian said, his voice cold. Her position is non-negotiable. Evelyn's smile tightened. "We'll see." Over the next few months, Evelyn became a constant, disruptive presence. She questioned every decision Julian made. She built alliances with the older, more conservative members of the board, men who had been loyal to Julian's father, and were wary of his son's more modern, methodical approach. She was subtle, chipping away at Julian's authority, planting seeds of doubt. The flashpoint came during the negotiations for a massive merger with a clean energy company in Germany. It was Julian's passion project, a deal that would pivot the old industrial giant toward a sustainable future. The deal was incredibly complex, hinging on international patents and delicate negotiations. Clara was in the thick of it, her eye for detail proving invaluable in vetting the hundreds of pages of legal documents. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Clara walked into Julian's office. The mood was funereal. Julian was standing by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. Two grim-faced men in dark suits, head of security and the chief legal counsel, were standing near his desk. And sitting in one of the leather chairs, looking the picture of concern, was Evelyn Reed. "Clara, come in," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, a sense of dread washing over her. Julian turned around. His face was pale, his grey eyes stormy with a pain so profound it made her ache. "The Germans pulled out," he said, his voice hoarse. "The merger is off." "Why?" "Because someone leaked our final offer and negotiation strategy directly to their biggest competitor," he said, his voice cracking. "The competitor made a counteroffer this morning, undercutting us by pennies on the dollar, but using our own proprietary data to do it. The deal was sabotaged from the inside." He threw a file onto the desk. It slid open, revealing printouts of network logs and emails. The leak was traced. It came from a high-level encrypted login, sent from an off-site IP address at 2:17 this morning. He looked at her, and the trust she had come to cherish in his eyes was gone, replaced by a devastating cocktail of betrayal and confusion. "It was sent from your corporate account, Clara, from the IP address registered to your apartment." Clara's world dissolved. "What? No! That's impossible. I was asleep. I would never." "The evidence is irrefutable," Evelyn cut in smoothly. "We've also discovered a series of encrypted payments made over the last 2 months to an offshore account. The account is untraceable, but the initial deposit matches the exact amount the competitor paid for the information." She placed a hand on Julian's arm. "I'm so sorry, Julian. I warned you she was a risk." "It's a lie!" Clara cried, looking desperately at Julian. "She's framing me. Julian, you know me. You have to believe me." He looked at her, his face a mask of conflict. He wanted to believe her. She could see it in the anguish in his eyes. But he was the architect, a man who built his life on data and evidence, and the evidence was damning. "I trusted you," he whispered, and the words were like a physical blow. "I brought you into the heart of my company, into my life. And I would never betray that trust." "Then explain the logs. Explain the money." "I can't, because I didn't do it." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if in immense pain. When he opened them, they were once again the cold, flat grey of a winter sky. The wall was back up. "Security will escort you from the building," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Your access is revoked. Pack your personal belongings from your office. The rest will be sent to you. You're fired, Miss Miller." "Julian, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Get her out," he said, turning his back on her. As the security guards took her arms, she looked past Julian's rigid back at Evelyn Reed. Evelyn met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, her mask of sympathy dropped. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Clara was deposited onto the sidewalk in the rain, clutching a small box of her personal effects. The corporate apartment, the car service, the security of a life she was just starting to build, all of it, gone in an instant. She had been flying, and Evelyn Reed had just cut her wings. But as she stood there, shivering and heartbroken, the anger began to burn away the despair. Evelyn was smart, but she was arrogant. She had built a perfect digital cage to frame her. But Clara's expertise wasn't in the digital world, it was in the physical one, in paper and ink and the mistakes people make when they think no one is looking at the details. Evelyn had made a mistake somewhere. Clara knew it, and she would find it. Not for the job, not even for Julian, but for herself. She would not let her name, the only thing she truly owned, be destroyed by a lie. Clara spent the first 24 hours in a daze, staying with her old babysitter, Mrs. Gable, who took her and Danny in without a single question. The humiliation was a physical weight, but beneath it, her mind was working, sifting through every interaction, every document, every conversation she'd had in the last few months. The digital evidence was too perfect, a flawless frame. So the mistake had to be in the real world. Evelyn was meticulous, but she had one weakness, a sense of theatricality, a love for the grand gesture that was at odds with her icy demeanor. It was a trait she shared with Julian's late father, a man whose portrait hung in the boardroom, his eyes seeming to follow you with a mixture of charm and menace. Clara's mind snagged on a memory, an expense report she had reviewed for Evelyn weeks ago. It was mostly routine, lavish dinners, first-class flights. But one charge had seemed odd, a payment of several $1,000s to a company called Boutique Secure Couriers. It was unusual because the company had its own internal, highly secure courier service. Why would Evelyn use an outside firm? At the time, Clara had flagged it as a potential redundancy to be streamlined, but now it felt like a loose thread. She needed to get back into the archives. Her own access was gone, but there was a back door. Frank, the head of building security, was a gruff man in his late 60s, nearing retirement. Evelyn had tried to force him out, calling him obsolete, but Julian had intervened. Clara had always made a point to bring Frank a coffee in the mornings and ask about his grandchildren. She had his personal cell number. She dialed it. "Frank, it's Clara Miller." "I know who it is, kid." His voice was gruff but not unkind. "Heard what happened? It's a raw deal." "It's more than that, Frank. I was framed, and I think the proof is in the central archives in the sub-basement. I need you to let me in. Tonight." There was a long pause. "Clara, I could lose my pension, my job, I know, but Evelyn is going to do more than that. She's not just after me. She's after Julian." She did not return to the gutter. She returned to the cold, damp quiet of Mrs. Gable's spare room, a space that smelled of mothballs and lavender soap. For 2 days, Clara existed in a state of suspended animation, the world muted and distant. Danny, with the profound and uncomplicated intuition of a child, seemed to understand. He didn't ask about their grand apartment, with its view of the clouds, or why they were suddenly eating macaroni from a box instead of the organic meals delivered to their door. He simply leaned against her, his small hand finding hers, anchoring her to a reality she had to reclaim. The shame was a physical presence, a cold stone in her stomach. Julian's words, "I trusted you," echoed in the silence, each syllable a fresh cut. He hadn't shouted. He had whispered, and the whisper had been the sound of a universe collapsing. On the third morning, the stone of shame began to glow with the heat of rage. It was a slow, creeping warmth that started in her chest and spread to her fingertips. She was not a victim. She was a variable Evelyn Reed had failed to properly calculate. Julian trusted data. Evelyn had given him a flawless set of data that pointed to a lie. Clara's only path forward was to find a different kind of data, the kind that lived on paper, in the smudges of ink and the folds of receipts, the physical ghost of a digital crime. The thought solidified into a plan. She remembered the expense reports, the courier. It was a thread so thin it was almost invisible, but it was all she had. She took Danny to the park, pushing him on the swings, the rhythmic creak of the chains a metronome for her thoughts. She watched him laugh, his head thrown back, the new brace, the one Julian's money had paid for, a cruel and constant reminder of what she had lost. But it was also a reminder of what she was fighting for. This wasn't about a job or an apartment with a view. It was about her name. It was about ensuring her son would never know his mother as a thief. That evening, after Danny was asleep, she called Frank. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the phone rang. "Yeah." His voice was a gravelly rumble. "Frank, it's Clara Miller." A pause. "Figured you'd call. Heard you put on quite a show." The words were gruff, but they lacked the condemnation she'd expected. "It wasn't a show, Frank. It was a lie. I was framed, and I think the proof is in the Central Archives, the physical copies of Evelyn's expense reports." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, freighted with the weight of his pension, his mortgage, his entire life's work. "Kid, you're asking me to commit career suicide. They've got cameras everywhere, new protocols. Evelyn's people are crawling all over the system. I know what I'm asking, but you know what she is. You were loyal to Julian's father. You saw what he built. Evelyn isn't building. She's demolishing. She started with me. She'll end with Julian. She'll sell that company for parts and call it progress. I don't need hours. I need 20 minutes. I know exactly what I'm looking for." She could hear him breathing, a long, weary sigh that spoke of decades of thankless loyalty. "The man you're asking me to protect is the same man who threw you out on the street." "He was wrong," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He was betrayed and he made a mistake, a terrible one. But he's not a monster. She is. Please, Frank." Another silence. Then, "Sub-level C, Power Junction Corridor 4B. There's a 4-minute dead spot in the camera feed when the system reboots for its nightly diagnostic. Happens at 02:17 a.m. every night. Same time the so-called hack happened." Ironic, huh? "You've got 4 minutes, Clara. Not a second more. If you're not out, I don't know you." The line went dead. The air in the sub-basement was cold and smelled of aging paper and ozone. Clara moved with the practiced efficiency of her old life, a ghost in the fluorescent hum. At 02:16, she stood before the heavy steel door of the archives, her heart a frantic drum. The magnetic lock clicked open. Frank. She slipped inside, pulling on a pair of latex gloves from her pocket. The room was a cathedral of forgotten facts. She didn't waste time. Board of Directors, fiscal year, current. Her fingers, nimble and sure, flew through the files. She found Evelyn's section and pulled the entire stack of physical expense reports. She didn't have time to analyze them there. She slid them into a large tote bag, took out her phone, and snapped a picture of the empty space in the file, a time-stamped record of her presence. It was a risk, but it was also her alibi. She couldn't fight a digital phantom with whispers. She needed her own data. She was out of the room with 30 seconds to spare. Her breath held tight in her chest until she heard the heavy thump of the mag lock re-engaging behind her. She didn't stop moving until she was back in the pre-dawn chill, the tote bag a lead weight in her hand. Back in Mrs. Gable's spare room, with the first grey light of morning filtering through the blinds, she spread the documents across the floor. It was all there. The receipt from Boutique Secure Couriers, a tangible object, the ink slightly raised on the thermal paper. The destination, a logistics firm in Berlin. The recipient, a numbered holding company. A quick search on her phone confirmed her fears. The holding company was a known shell corporation for the competitor who had torpedoed the German merger. The digital hack was the murder weapon left at the crime scene. This receipt was the photograph of the real killer buying the actual gun. But it wasn't enough. Evelyn would deny it. She would claim it was a different set of documents. Clara needed the motive. She needed the architect of the frame-up itself. She scanned the reports again, her eyes blurring from exhaustion. She was looking for something that didn't belong, a payment that felt wrong. And then she saw it. A recurring payment, listed under consulting fees, to an entity named only L. Finch. The invoices were masterpieces of corporate vagueness, network penetration audits, digital infrastructure fortification. But the amounts were staggering, and the final payment, the largest by far, was dated the day after the leak, the day she was fired. L. Finch. The name sparked a memory, a security audit she had initiated weeks ago, a deep dive into all third-party contractors. Leo Finch was a pariah in the cybersecurity world, a brilliant but mercenary programmer who sold his skills to the highest bidder, legal or otherwise. She had flagged his file for Julian, recommending immediate termination of his contract, a contract she now realized was not with the company, but with Evelyn personally. She had the whole story, a trail of paper breadcrumbs leading from Evelyn's ambition to Clara's destruction. But presenting this to the board would be a circus. Evelyn would shred her on the stand, painting her as a vengeful ex-employee with forged documents. She couldn't win in their arena. She had to choose her own. She had to go to Julian, not to the CEO, but to the man who saw details, who valued provenance. She had to present her case in the one place he couldn't hide behind a board of directors, his office. Getting to the 85th floor was the final, most audacious part of her plan. She wouldn't get past the lobby, but she didn't need to. She still had Eleanor's direct line memorized. At 8:30 a.m. she called. Julian Croft's office. Eleanor's voice was crisp, professional, and cold. Eleanor, it's Clara Miller. The silence was glacial. I have nothing to say to you. You don't have to say anything. You just have to listen. I know you've served the Croft family for 30 years. I know you were here when Julian's father was in charge. And I know your loyalty is to the company, to the legacy, not to any single person. Evelyn Reed is about to burn that legacy to the ground. I have proof, irrefutable, physical proof. All I'm asking is that you put a single, sealed envelope on Julian's desk. If you believe its contents are meaningless, I will disappear forever. But if you believe in the man he's trying to become, you'll do it. She hung up before Eleanor could refuse. She put copies of the courier receipt, the Finch invoices, and her own flagged security report on Leo Finch into a plain manila envelope. She paid a city bike messenger his last $20 to deliver it to the Croft Enterprises mailroom, addressed to Eleanor, marked with the internal code for personal and confidential. Then she went to a small coffee shop across the street from the tower of black glass and steel, and she waited. Julian hadn't slept. He'd spent the last 3 days adrift in a sea of data that made perfect sense and a gut feeling that screamed in protest. He had re-examined the logs, the IP traces, the encrypted payment records. The evidence against Clara was a fortress, perfectly constructed, unassailable. Yet, every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face in the boardroom. The raw shock, the desperate plea. He saw her in the restaurant, calmly explaining the provenance of a wine he had no intention of drinking. He heard her voice, steady and sure, telling him why she worked 60 hours a week. I have a son. He had built his empire on the principle that emotion was a liability and data was truth. He had stripped the sentimentality from his father's chaotic conglomerate and replaced it with cold, hard logic. And that logic had led him to shatter the most valuable asset he'd ever found. He had looked at the one person who had never lied to him, and he had called her a liar. The self-loathing was a physical sickness. He was staring out the window, watching the city that felt like a cage, when Eleanor entered, her face an unreadable mask. She placed a single manila envelope on his desk. "This arrived for you, Julian, from a source I believe you will find compelling." He didn't ask. He knew. His hands trembled as he opened the clasp. He slid the documents out, the courier receipt, the invoices, the security report with her neat, precise handwriting in the margins. L. Finch, major security risk, unethical history, recommend immediate termination of all contracts. The fortress of data crumbled. It hadn't been a fortress at all. It had been a stage set, meticulously designed to look real from the front. And he, the architect, the master of details, had never bothered to look behind it. He had been so focused on the digital performance that he had missed the physical reality. The paper, the ink, the real-world logistics of betrayal. Evelyn hadn't just framed Clara. She had used his own rigid methodology against him, knowing he would trust the elegant, clean data over the messy, complicated truth of a human being. He sank into his chair, the papers spread before him like the wreckage of his own certainty. The betrayal was deeper now, more insidious. It wasn't just that Evelyn had sabotaged the company. It was that she had made him her weapon. She had used his own principles to force him to destroy the one person who embodied the very integrity he claimed to value. He hadn't just fired Clara. He had executed her career, her reputation, her life, all on the word of a traitor. He pressed the intercom. "Eleanor, get Evelyn Reed in my office, now." Clara watched from the coffee shop as the minutes ticked by. An hour passed, then another. Doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp. Maybe he'd looked at the proof and dismissed it. Maybe his pride was a wall too high for the truth to climb. She was just about to give up, to gather her things and retreat into a life of quiet defeat. When her phone buzzed, it was an unknown number. "Clara." Julian's voice was raw, frayed. She couldn't speak. Can you come up? Please, I need you to be here." The ride up in the elevator was an ascent through layers of memory. The first time, nervous and hopeful. The second, broken and fired. This time, she felt nothing but a vast, cold calm. She was not here for a job or for an apology. She was here to bear witness. Eleanor met her at the reception, her expression softened with a flicker of respect. She simply nodded toward the office door. Clara pushed it open. The scene inside was a tableau of quiet violence. Julian was behind his desk, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him, the evidence laid out before him. Evelyn was in one of the leather chairs, her posture rigid, her face pale but composed. She looked at Clara, and her eyes were chips of ice. "Well," Evelyn said, her voice a silken weapon. "The little mouse returns to the scene of the crime. Have you come to beg for your job back, darling?" "I'm afraid that ship has sailed." Clara ignored her. She looked only at Julian. "You wanted me here," she said, her voice level. "I wanted you to see this," he said, his voice thick with a pain that went beyond business. He slid the courier receipt across the desk toward Evelyn. "This is a receipt for a package you sent to Berlin 2 days before the merger collapsed. A package sent to a shell company owned by our competitor." Evelyn glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. "Business documents. Entirely routine. You're grasping at straws, Julian. It's pathetic. And these," he continued, pushing the invoices for Leo Finch toward her, "are payments for a digital security consultant. The same consultant Clara flagged as a mercenary for hire weeks ago. You paid him to build the digital ghost that you used to haunt her." Evelyn laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. "Proof. You have receipts. I have network logs, IP addresses, Encrypted financial transactions, a mountain of digital fact against a few scraps of paper. Who are they going to believe, Julian? You? The man who hired a waitress to run his company's most sensitive department? Or me? The woman who saw the rot and tried to cut it out? She stood up, leaning her hands on his desk, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It doesn't even matter if it's true, don't you see? I did it for the company, for your father's legacy. You were weak, sentimental. This little project, she gestured dismissively at Clara, was the final proof. You were going to run this empire into the ground. I did what was necessary. I was the architect of a necessary change. You, of all people, should appreciate that. It was then that Clara saw the full depth of her malice. She hadn't just committed a crime, she believed it was her right. She saw Julian not as a person to be defeated, but as an obstacle to be logically removed. Julian looked from Evelyn's triumphant, twisted face to Clara's quiet, resolute one. And in that moment, the final piece of his old self shattered. His father had built an empire on ruthlessness. Evelyn was his father's true heir. But Julian didn't want that legacy. The difference between us, Evelyn, he said, his voice suddenly calm and clear, is that you build cages. You built one for Clara, and you tried to build one for me. But you made a mistake. You thought the bars were made of data. They're not. He stood up, no longer looking defeated, but transformed. They're made of trust, and you don't have any left here. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Frank, you can come in now. The police are on their way. Evelyn's composure finally cracked, not into a scream, but into something far more chilling, a look of pure reptilian hatred. As Frank and another guard entered the room, she turned her venom on Clara. You should have stayed a ghost, she hissed. Insignificant. Then she was gone. The silence she left behind was immense, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. The city lights began to flicker on, dotting the twilight vista outside the massive window. Julian walked around the desk until he was standing before Clara. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a galaxy of regret. I am programmed to trust the data, Clara, he began, his voice barely a whisper. It was my creed. My father. He was a brilliant, charming monster who trusted no one and was betrayed by everyone. I thought if I just relied on the evidence, on the cold, hard facts, I could build something clean, something safe. He gestured around the vast, empty office. This room, this company, it's been a fortress to keep the chaos of human emotion out. When the data told me you betrayed me, I chose the fortress over the person. It was the most catastrophic failure of my life. Not because it cost me a deal, but because it cost me my own integrity. I let it blind me to the one truth I should have known in my gut. That you were the only person in this building who was incapable of that kind of betrayal. He finally met her eyes. I'm sorry is a pathetic, inadequate phrase for what I did to you. I don't know if I can ever earn your forgiveness. Clara listened, her own armor cracking. She saw not the architect, but a man haunted by his father's ghosts, a man who had tried to logic his way out of a legacy of pain. You broke my trust, Julian, she said, her voice trembling with the force of her contained grief and anger. You didn't just fire me. You believed, even for a second, that I was capable of destroying you. You threw me back into the world I had fought my entire life to crawl out of. Do you know what that feels like? No, he said, his own voice breaking. But I'm beginning to understand. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel it again, if you'll let me. He took a step closer. I don't want to offer you a job. That's not what this is. A job is what I gave you when I saw you as an asset. What I need now is a partner. Someone to help me tear down this fortress and build something better in its place. Something based not just on data, but on discernment, on character, on the things that don't show up on a balance sheet. He gestured to the chair Evelyn had just vacated. I need a chief operating officer. But more than that, I need a conscience. I need the person who came back, not for revenge, but for the truth. Clara looked at him, at the wreckage of their professional relationship, and the fragile, tentative blueprint of something new. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you could flip. It was a structure you had to build piece by piece. The truth is a hard thing to build with, Julian, she said softly. It's not always clean or logical. I know, he said. You've already taught me that. He offered a small, broken smile. The compensation package will be significant, and it will be offered with a humility I didn't know I was capable of. A week later, Clara stood not in Julian's office, but in her own, a spacious corner office next to his. Her title, Chief Operating Officer, was etched in quiet, silver letters on the door. It still felt unreal. The work was a mountain, sifting through the damage Evelyn had caused, rebuilding trust with employees and partners. That evening, Julian appeared in her doorway. He didn't enter, just leaned against the frame. He looked tired, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet purpose. Danny's physical therapist called me, he said. He said the progress is remarkable. He said Danny asked if Mr. Croft could come watch him walk the parallel bars next week. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. He'd like that. I'd like that too, Julian said. He paused. I cleared my schedule. It was a small sentence, but it was everything. He was choosing the human detail over the corporate agenda. He was learning a new language. Clara looked out her window at the tapestry of lights that was Chicago. She had walked into this world a servant, been remade into an archivist, cast out as a traitor, and returned as a partner. It had been a crucible, just as she'd first thought, but she had not been tested for its fire. She had been tempered by it. Julian, she said, turning back to him. Yes, Clara? A genuine smile touched her lips, the first one she had offered him since her return. We have a lot of work to do. He smiled back, a real smile that reached his winter sky eyes and warmed them like the spring. I know, he said. Let's get to building. And as they stood in the quiet hum of the skyscraper, two people from different worlds, bound by a shared, brutal truth, they both knew they weren't just rebuilding a company. They were building a foundation, one that was forged not of steel and glass, but of something far stronger, far more resilient, and infinitely more valuable.